This is Dom Bettinelli, the CEO of SQPN, with a brief but very important message. For more than a decade, SQPN has produced the Catholic faith and pop culture podcasts that you love. We're a nonprofit organization, so it's only your generosity that lets us carry out our mission. We haven't run a fundraiser in 2 years, and that's why we need to ask for your help right now. Please make a pledge of whatever amount you can afford to help us continue providing your favorite podcasts, as well as exciting new ones we have planned. To make your pledge and find out about the free thank you gifts we'd like to send you, visit sqpn.com/give. That's sqpn.com/give. Thank you for your generosity. May we hear from you today? You're listening to episode 12 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries both supernatural and natural, anything that's strange, odd, and makes you wonder, the claims and counterclaims from the perspectives of both faith and reason. And in this episode, we're talking about the secret Soviet Doomsday Machine. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Hi. So first I want to, as usual, remind people to like Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on Facebook. We have a Facebook page. To retweet us on Twitter when we post our shows, to comment, to subscribe in iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, and YouTube. And when you subscribe on YouTube, make sure you hit the bell to get notifications when we post a new episode. And please share the podcast with your friends to help us grow our audience and grow the community of listeners so that we have very interesting conversations, especially in Mysterious Feedback, which is coming up at the end of this episode. So, all that said, let's talk about Doomsday Machines. This is a nice back to the 80s sort of episode. So what is this? Well, let's first talk about what is a Doomsday Machine, Jimmy?
Yeah, well, basically, a Doomsday Machine is a planet killer. It's a device that's meant to either exterminate all life on a planet, or, it could blow up the planet itself, but it's at least meant to exterminate either all life or all human life, or at least human civilization. So maybe there'd be a few people who'd survive, but they'd be blasted back to the Stone Age. And thus it would effectively bring on a kind of secular doomsday. These machines have appeared in fiction for a long time in a lot of different forms. Sometimes they are under the direct control of a person who can push the button and end the world. And sometimes they are depicted as operating automatically, to where they're set to just go off if certain conditions are met without a human having to push the button, without a human trigger.
Okay, and so it's not so much like Skynet, which is like a malevolent AI takes its own action per se, because it wasn't designed to do that, but sort of more like Whopper in what was the movie now? I remember the name of the computer. The one from the 80s where the kid accidentally hacks into
War Games.
War Games. Yes. Oh my gosh. Mm-hmm. The trivia I remember and the things I don't remember, which was designed to be I don't know if that was technically qualified, but anyway, we get the idea.
It was definitely a big automatic defense system that had control of nuclear weapons.
Right.
The lesson of the movie was you can save the world by teaching a computer tic-tac-toe.
Exactly. That is the ultimate lesson. We should have taught tic-tac-toe to Skynet. So we understand what a doomsday machine is, and they are technically possible to build, right? These aren't just fantasy.
Yeah. Sometimes people will look at science fiction concepts of planet killers and say, well, these are just ridiculous. These are impossible. But in fact, no, they're not. Some planet killers you see in science fiction, there's no way we could build that. And in some cases, maybe there's no way anyone could build that. But there are ways to at least destroy human civilization and even all human life on Earth. And we'll be talking about some of those ways later.
Okay. And they could be anything from explosive devices to pandemics to chemical means or the various ways to kill off everyone very completely.
the easiest ways for us to do it with our level of technology would either be a biological plague that kills humans and is unstoppable, or what's even more within our reach is just launching tons of nuclear weapons.
Right.
At one point, back in the 80s, both we and the Russians had just incredibly vast thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. And if we'd set them off all at once, it would have really caused a big problem. But there's a special kind of bomb that we'll be talking about where just one bomb could do the whole thing.
Ooh, okay. I want to hear about that. But first, why would you build a gun that can kill everyone at once? Basically, because that seems like a bad idea for the person pulling the trigger.
Yeah, well, it could be something that a megalomaniac would do. You see in science fiction the kind of Bond villain strutting megalomaniac. If the world doesn't bend the knee to me, I'm going to kill everybody, and I don't care if I go to. That's less likely, though, because not a lot of strutting megalomaniacs have the resources to build a doomsday machine. Another possibility is a group of people with an extreme apocalyptic ideology where they think it's their job to bring on doomsday, could do this. And we know groups with ideologies like that exist. Charles Manson, the Manson family, basically, he thought it was the family's duty to bring on Armageddon, literally, a race war that he called Helter Skelter. Various Muslim sects have an ideology where they need to bring about the end times as they understand them. And, I remember back in the 80s, people would some people would get suspicious of evangelicals and say, they think they need to usher in the second coming of Christ by bringing on the end of the world. And that played into some Cold War fears then. That, of course, was totally ungrounded. Evangelicals don't have that view. But a single person, regardless of their perspective, could, let's say a rogue military officer, could have an apocalyptic ideology and go off the reservation and order an attack that could start a nuclear war.
Right.
That was something the Pentagon started worrying about in the 1960s, and it became the basis of the movie Dr. Strangelove, where an officer named Air Force General named Jack T. Ripper does exactly that. And we'll be talking about that a little more later in the episode. The most realistic reason, though, why someone would build a doomsday machine is as a deterrent strategy. One of the things that got really worked over during the Cold War was the game theory. Game theory is the study of how, obviously, how do you win in a given scenario and how do different scenarios affect the competing parties' interests. And so a lot of work was done on game theory during the Cold War. And in contemplating the use of nuclear weapons, one of the big questions that had to be settled was, when do you strike? And there are basically three options. The first is you strike first before the other guy has a chance. You do a first strike. And in a global thermonuclear war, you would want this to be a massive first strike that's going to take out as much of your enemy's ability to strike back as possible. If you don't want to do a first strike, though, the next option is launch on warning. So as soon as you have credible reports that there are missiles in the air coming your way, you don't wait for them to land. That's when you launch your missiles. There are some problems with the launch on warning strategy, though. One of them is in the actual Cold War, America at one point had missiles that were within 10 to 15 minutes of the Kremlin. And that meant they would have just a vanishingly brief amount of time to verify, are these reports real? Or are we, as happened on one occasion, watching a flock of geese that just happens to have a radar echo that looks like a missile? They wouldn't have hardly any time to make that decision. And consequently, they could make bad decisions. They might decide not to launch, in which case their entire leadership could be decapitated. All the leaders could be dead, and there would be chaos and nobody to send the order to launch a counterstrike. Also, one of the things they found out in the Soviet Union when they did drills, as you know, like surprise ones, people didn't know it was a drill in advance. They found that a lot of the underlings might not execute their orders. So they would send like a warning message to all their guys in the missile silos saying, this is it, we're under attack. And the underlings, instead of launching, would get on the phone to try to confirm, is this real or not?
Mm-hmm.
And
in fact, that was the premise to War Games, the movie. Like the very beginning showed us one of these drills in which the U.S. Missile officers, one of them wouldn't launch, and then they revealed that many of them didn't. In this drill, right?
Yeah, and that's human nature. There are even, a lot of the people who were involved in a lot of this, leaders and stuff during the Cold War later said, I don't know if I would launch or not. Even if my country was being destroyed, what's the point of destroying everything else?
Right.
At that point. So there were real worries about whether the counterstrike would actually happen. And then that leads us to the third option, which is launch on impact. Once you've actually absorbed some damage, you know for a fact that the bombs are going off. It wasn't a flock of geese. It wasn't a computer glitch. You really have bombs going off in your homeland. That's when you launch your counterstrike. The problem there is a lot of your counterstrike may have been destroyed in that first wave. Also, you may have had a leadership decapitation, and once again, the underlings may not respond, either because of confused communications or because they just don't want to launch. So that led to a couple of interesting developments. One of them was actually the internet. The internet was originally called the ARPANET, and it was a project of DARPA, which is a kind of government technological research and development think tank. And the idea was, okay, if we're in a nuclear war and we're taking active damage, bombs are going off in the US, they're going to be punching holes in our communications network. And that's going to produce a problem if you're in wherever you are, let's say a secure bunker somewhere, you're the president, you got out of Washington. And how do you communicate with the people under your authority with all these holes punched in the communications network with, telephone nodes being destroyed and things like that? And the solution they came up with was, well, what if we fragment information into packets, like an email is when you send it, it's broken up into packets, and then it takes various routes to the destination server. And and if one server is down somewhere, it just routes around that by going to a different server. And so you could hopefully maintain command and control through the ARPANET by fragmenting your communications, your orders, into packets that then get routed around the nuclear blast sites where your communications grid has taken damage. And this system proved so useful that eventually it was released to the public. But people may not have been aware that that's actually how we got the internet. It was a byproduct of Cold War thinking. The other way of dealing with some of the launch on impact problems is to create either an automated or semi-automated doomsday machine, something that will go off and will kill your opponent if they attack you. And so if they then know that you've got a doomsday machine, and even if they decapitate your leadership, take out all your government and military leaders, there is still something, quite possibly an automated machine, with no human involvement, that will then fire the retaliatory strike that will take you out. And so that's the most, quote unquote, sane reason that one might want to build a doomsday machine as a deterrent to being attacked nuclearly.
Okay. So those are the reasons why. So what what doomsday machines have there been? I mean, we're going to be talking primarily about the secret Soviet doomsday machine, but I guess that there have been some theories presented in the past and
Proposals, yeah.
proposals, yeah.
The first one was by a physicist named Leo Szilard. He was from Hungary. He also lived for a time in Germany, and then he eventually came to America. He was the guy, Leo Szilard, was the guy who first thought of the idea of using a chain reaction. He had been reading an article reporting on a speech by the British New Zealand, I guess British Kiwi physicist Lord Rutherford, who had been saying, it doesn't look like we'll ever be able to extract useful atomic energy from fissile materials. I mean, yeah, they emit uranium emits energy, but it doesn't. There's no way to get much out of it, and because either a single atom releases a neutron or it doesn't. And Szilard thought, well, wait a minute. What if you could get one atom releasing a neutron to trigger another atom to release a neutron, or a couple of them? And if you had everything set up right, you could have a doubling effect where, one neutron gets released, then 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, and so on, until you have millions of neutrons being released all at once. And that chain reaction would let you extract nuclear energy from fissile materials. You could build a nuclear reactor to generate power, or Szilard realized you could build a bomb. And he thought of this in 1933, the idea of a chain reaction, and it became practical just a few years later in World War II. So Szilard worked on nuclear weapons, and he was the first to propose the idea of a doomsday bomb design. He said that you could create a bomb that would make, because one of the things that happens when atoms release neutrons is they activate, it's called neutron activation. They make nearby atoms radioactive and can change them from one element into another, or at least one isotope into another. And so he said, look, if we found an isotope that, say, had a half-life of 5 years, then we could set up a bomb that would make bunches of this half-life element. As the bomb is exploding, it's releasing all those neutrons, it's activating all of the material in itself and in its casing. And if we can get it to turn into the right element, then when it blows apart, it will put fallout all over the earth that will, and with that 5-year half-life, it'll kill everybody. And so you could have one bomb that would literally end all life on Earth. And the element that ended up being proposed to do that is an isotope of cobalt called cobalt-60. The reason that 5-year half-life is important is because, what a half-life is the length of time it takes for a chunk of material to lose half of its radioactivity. That's why it's called a half-life. So it'll go, initially it'll have all its radioactivity, then it'll have half, then a quarter, then an eighth, then a 16th, and so forth, every time a new half-life is reached. But different elements have different half-lives, and generally the higher up the element is on the periodic table, the shorter its half-life. So we've got like the very high elements like 116 and 118, they have these just very fractionally short half-lives. You can only make them for a few seconds before they radiate and break down into some lesser element. Well, the thing about those very short half-lives is they mean even if they kill some people locally, they're going to decay into more stable elements before they cover the world. Okay. And so they're not going to kill people long term. On the other hand, elements that have really long half-lives, they'll release neutrons over time, but not enough to kill you. Right. Uranium, the standard uranium isotope that we find in nature is like that. I mean, historically, it has a nice yellow color, and people would paint their dishes with it. And even though it's uranium and it does emit neutrons, it emits them so infrequently that, and other radioactive particles. It emits them so infrequently that it doesn't hurt anybody. It's perfectly safe. So what you want, if you really want to kill a bunch of people, is a middle range half-life, something that will let the fallout go everywhere and still decay enough that it will kill people when it gets there. And so the idea of building a cobalt-60 bomb is what makes the idea of a doomsday, or a similar one, is what makes the idea of a single doomsday device really possible. The good news is they never built this. It was just an idea that Szilard came up with for discussion, but neither we nor the Soviets built at least a world-killing cobalt bomb.
Is it possible to build? I mean, is it just a theory? So someone, how difficult would it be for someone to build one of these things? Just, to settle my mind a little bit.
It would be difficult. It's going to be harder than just building, say, a regular atomic bomb or even a hydrogen bomb.
Okay.
But it's quite possible. The theory is easy. The trouble, and that's true of atomic bombs across the board, understanding how they work and how to design them is the easy part. Getting the fissile materials you need to fuel them is the hard part. So, like, lots of people know how to build bombs, but never can. Lots of countries know how to build bombs, but they don't, either because they don't want to or because they haven't figured out how to refine the materials you need to make a bomb. Like making your uranium bomb, you actually don't want the isotope of uranium that's most commonly found in nature. You want a very special one that you either have to make or purify. And that's the hard part. Right.
From my understanding is the creation of the bomb itself, not even just the radioactive material, but the technical specs for the technical processes of even just building the casing and the detonator are extremely technically difficult.
Although it depends on the bomb type. If you're using an implosion device, then that's really hard to get a sphere of fissile material to implode evenly all at once.
Yeah.
But if you're using a gun type nuclear weapon where you've got a piece of fissile material at one end and a piece of fissile material at the other end, and you just need to force them together quickly enough, like a bullet going through a barrel, that's actually pretty easy.
Oh, that doesn't make me feel better. But so let's move on from that. This show is not necessarily going to make you feel better until the very end, but hopefully we'll have something positive at the end. All right, so that's Doomsday Machine number 1. What do we got for Doomsday Machine number 2?
So this is an expansion, a fictional one, of some things that we've already talked about. It's found in the movie Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. This is a Stanley Kubrick film from the 1960s, and it is a dark comedy. It's considered a brilliant satire of 1960s Cold War thinking. And in it, Air Force General Jack T. Ripper does order a first strike on the Soviet Union. And so all these planes start heading towards the Soviet Union without the U.S. president having authorized this. So the U.S. president immediately contacts the Russians. They send over the Russian ambassador. They get the Russian premier on the phone. And lo and behold, it turns out the Russians have built a doomsday machine that the Americans didn't know about. And so if they can't stop all those planes, this device is going to activate and kill everybody on the planet. And so the plot then becomes a race to stop the planes in one way or another. And they try different things to stop planes. And I won't give away the ending of the movie. It is very funny. But in the process of talking about the Soviet doomsday machine that the Russian premier has authorized to be built, the Russian ambassador explains what it is. He says it's actually pretty simple. You get a set of bombs, you jacket them in something he calls cobalt thorium G. And so there's some realism here. I mean, they picked the right element, cobalt. They've also got the element thorium mixed in there for some reason, and I don't know what the G stands for. but they're trying to think realistically, and they're basing this on, things that people are actually talking about. This is essentially Leo Szilard's idea, coupled with American fears about a rogue officer setting off a nuclear war. And so the Russian ambassador says that the machine, if activated, will, explode these bombs, and then it will put the Earth under a doomsday shroud of fallout that will kill everybody. And the machine's already been activated; it cannot be deactivated. And at that point, the American president wants some independent confirmation of what the Russian ambassador is telling him, and he turns to Dr. Strangelove. Now, Dr. Strangelove is a German scientist played by Peter Sellers. Interestingly, Peter Sellers also plays two other roles in this movie. He also plays a British liaison officer to the American military, and he plays the American president himself. But since he's wearing a bald cap and does such a good American accent, I had no idea that was Peter Sellers talking to himself as Dr. Strangelove for the longest time. In any event, he turns to Dr. Strangelove and says, "Is this possible?" And Dr. Strangelove says, "Oh, yes, it would be simple. Even the smallest nuclear power could do this. It just requires the will to do so." But then Dr. Strangelove asks the Russian ambassador a very important question.
The whole point of the Doomsday machine is lost. If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
It was to be announced at the party congress on Monday. As you know, the premier loves surprises.
So they were going to tell everybody, but they didn't do it just yet. They activated the machine first.
Surprise!
Yeah. So you may want to check out Dr. Strangelove for some really impressive dark comedy about all the stuff we're talking about today. Fortunately, of course, the status of this one, it's fictional. It was never built, but something like it would indeed be possible. And in fact, Russians were discussing building such a thing in the 1960s.
Interesting. And as we'll see, later generations of the idea kept the idea alive in the Soviet Union. But
yes.
So let's move on then to the next one, the next level of, or the next type of doomsday machine that we encounter in this Cold War history.
Yeah, so Doomsday Machine number 3 is something the details are pretty sketchy about. I learned about it a number of years ago, and I haven't been able to, in prepping for this episode, I haven't been able to find a lot of information about it. I was able to find a very short, 2-minute video about it, a clip from a documentary that's on YouTube, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes so you can watch it for yourself. But basically, in the 1960s, Soviet military planners came to their premier, Nikita Khrushchev, with a proposal for essentially a Dr. Strangelove-like device. The plan was, let's get a tanker, a ship, a big ship with big cargo holds, and fill it up with fissile materials, that is, materials capable of nuclear fission. We're going to fill it up with these nuclear materials. We'll put it in the Arctic Sea, and it'll cruise around on automatic pilot. It will cruise around up and down the northern border of Russia, and it'll be looking for bombs going off in the Soviet Union. And if it detects bombs going off in the Soviet Union, then the whole ship itself, as a bomb, will automatically detonate and kill everybody in the world. And
so a nuclear bomb the size of a tanker ship.
Exactly. And so they proposed it to Khrushchev, and he, fortunately, said no. He thought it was too crazy. And so the status of this one is it never got built because Khrushchev nixed the idea. So that was really nice of him. I really appreciate that. The pounding at the United Nations was a little rude, but nixing the atomic bomb tanker, I approve of that.
Yes, I agree with that. Okay, so but the idea of Soviet doomsday devices did not die with Khrushchev's tanker. We actually got closer than ever, didn't we, in the 80s?
We not only got closer, we got there. Here's what was happening. So in the 1980s, it was a really tense time in the Cold War. And one of the reasons for that was there was a generational shift that was about to happen in the Soviet Union. The guys who were the leaders at this time were all really old. They had been born early enough that they were either participants in the original Soviet revolution, or shortly thereafterwards they were involved, and so they were the old guard of the Soviet Union, and they were dying off. They were getting really old. Leaders who you may have heard of who belong to this group include Leonid Brezhnev, his successor Yuri Andropov, and his successor Konstantin Chernenko. And there was a lot of concern about the leadership problems that having these super old guys in charge was causing, because they were not in good health, and they were debilitated during portions of their tenure, and it was such a concern that actually Yuri Andropov, when he was preparing to die, he had a meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a young guy. He was part of the rising generation of Soviet leaders, and Andropov had been scheduled to give a speech that he couldn't give because of his health, and he was dying. But he wrote an addendum by hand to his speech, in which he asked the Communist Party leadership to consider replacing him with Gorbachev, not with the guy that was in the next position to move up, who was Chernenko. And so he was he knew Chernenko was in really bad health, and he wanted to skip Chernenko and go directly to the new generation. But Russian skullduggery. So that bit of his hand addendum got deleted. And so Konstantin Chernenko moved up on schedule. They had Andropov's funeral. Margaret Thatcher came, and she had these fur-lined boots because she was told she was going to have to stand in the cold for a long time at the funeral. And she thought, well, these are expensive, but looking at how unhealthy Chernenko is, I think I may get to use these boots again soon. And Chernenko was just, really in a downward spiral at this point. He was, they were giving him things like his sentences on note cards, or what he needed to say on note cards in really short sentences, because he was suffering from really bad emphysema. And he couldn't do long sentences. And then apparently half the time he was just stumbling through the cards, not even knowing what he's saying. So this was a really bad situation, and you didn't have good leadership. And there were a lot of questions in all the tension with America at the time. How is this guy going to act in a crisis? Is he going to freeze up? Is he going to do something premature? There's just not a lot of confidence in this guy. And so because of that, the Soviet military planners came up with a system that they hoped would mitigate the problems. And they called it Perimeter. That's its name. It's also related to a system called Dead Hand. Although it's unclear what the relationship is. Some people say that Dead Hand is just another name for Perimeter. Other people will say, no, Dead Hand was a proposed system that would have been fully automatic, but that they didn't build. What they did build was a semi-automatic doomsday system called Perimeter. And so the idea is they had built these control missiles. They were really good at rockets, and so they built these missiles that could launch that didn't carry warheads. Instead, they carried communications nodes, and these communications nodes could then broadcast down to any rockets or to any missiles that had not launched and tell them to launch. So if the Soviet Union took a first strike, the idea was these communications rockets will launch and they'll tell all of the other rockets that do carry warheads to launch. So, and that'll all happen automatically without any messy human meddling. So you don't have to worry about officers either not getting the order or not obeying the order. So that part of the system is automatic. As soon as the communications rockets go, everything happens automatically. They launch all of their remaining missiles, and the U.S. suffers a massive, massive thousands of warheads strike, which is potentially enough to kill everybody on the planet due to fallout. Now, they didn't want this because they had experience with mistaken signals, like the famous flock of geese incident. There were others as well. And so they didn't want the system to be fully automatic. So they made it semi-automatic. And what they did was they said, okay, we will only turn on perimeter in a crisis. So this is different than the Dr. Strangelove scenario. In Dr. Strangelove, it's always on and you can't turn it off. Here, it is normally off and then gets turned on in a crisis. And so, say the Kremlin would send an order turning on perimeter. And then there would be these guys who were constantly on duty in these little underground bunkers called globes. And they're so far underground, the globes are, that they would be impervious to nuclear strike. And so the guys in the globes then have a checklist that they're going through that includes factors like, has perimeter been activated? Well, if it's been activated, have we lost contact with the leaders, which would be a sign of decapitation?
Right.
Well, if we have lost contact with, if the system's active and we've lost contact with the leaders, do our seismic air pressure and radioactivity sensors tell us that bombs are going off? And if they say yes, okay, at that point, we launch the we launch the communications rockets. And so they had a element of human involvement here. Number one, they kept it switched off most of the time so that it would avoid accidents. And then they had a final check with the guys in the globes to evaluate stuff rather than leaving it to a computer that could break or be hacked or whatever. And so that was their proposal for how this should work. They thought it would help them survive a decapitation, but still have a final human check. On the other hand, drawbacks include human error and malfunctioning sensors and malfunctioning computers. So this system isn't absolutely safe either. What we do know is that unlike the previous ideas we talked about, they actually built this. It apparently went online like in 1984 or 1985.
Yeah, just to add a bit, a very interesting contemporary fact about this. The TV show The Americans was just ended this spring. It was about a deep cover Soviet agents living in the United States in the 80s, and the last season was surrounding the SALT talks, which was the nuclear disarmament talks between Gorbachev and Reagan.
Strategic arms limitation talks.
Yeah, and then as elements of the Soviet leadership who were opposed to Gorbachev's reforms, who were trying to create Dead Hand and put it online, this fully automatic system, and the spies being tasked with the duty to get certain American technology which they required. And so it's very interesting that we're talking about this now, and I just watched the final season of it now. But the other thing that came up actually in that show, and that we've kind of hit on here, was that flock of geese scenario. The necessity of having that human in the loop was this one Soviet colonel, rocket in the rocket forces, the equivalent of the American Strategic Air Command. who, when they got the signal that America had launched missiles, everything in his training, everything in the protocols and procedures said, we launch back. Yeah, that we should tell the Kremlin that the Americans have launched at us and that we need to launch our missiles. And he kept saying, why would they launch at us? Nothing's going on. There's no reason for them to have launched. This can't be right. And so he against all his training and all possibilities of reprisals against him for disobeying his orders, his standing orders, in the rules of engagement, he refused to take that step. And it turned out, it was just a flock of geese that fooled the Russian censors. And this one guy basically saved the world by refusing to obey his orders. So it just kind of reminds me of how important having a human in the system is when you're in nuclear brinksmanship. Yeah, and that's not the only case like that where one guy ended up preventing nuclear war. We'll talk about more in an upcoming episode. Yeah. So anyway, the Soviets did build perimeter, and it's interesting. The U.S. actually had not exactly the same thing, but something that was a little bit parallel to it. What we did was, instead of building bunkers underground for guys to look for attacks, we put planes in the air. Right. The Air Force had, between 1961 and 1990, the U.S. had planes in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They'd refuel in the air so they didn't have to land. And they would fly certain routes looking for missiles, looking for explosions, looking for evidence that an attack was underway. This was called Project Looking Glass. And if they detected an attack underway, they had the authorization, apparently, to get a counterstrike going. And so this was similar in function to perimeter, but it wasn't quite the same. One difference between Looking Glass and perimeter is we told the Soviets about it. We said, this is what we're doing. This is what these planes are for. Don't worry about them. They're just monitoring. But if you attack us, this is what the planes are going to do. And so that we let the Soviets know about it, and it's thought to have played a somewhat stabilizing role on the situation in the Cold War. However, the Soviets didn't tell us about perimeter, which brings us back to Dr. Strangelove's question.
The whole point of the Doomsday Machine is lost. If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
Exactly.
So why didn't they? And this is something that, we don't, because details of the perimeter program are, needless to say, classified by the Russians, and we don't have a lot of detail here. It's not entirely clear, but the indications we have is that they actually were thinking a step ahead in game theory. They weren't trying to deter us. They were trying to deter themselves. Because you had these, hotheads, you had, like in any country, you had hawks and doves. And so the Russian hawks would want to say, okay, if we even see missiles coming, we've got to launch on warning. We've got to get we got to get our missiles up in the air so they don't get destroyed. But launch on warning is really problematic because of the possibility of a mistaken launch. And then everything, goes to pieces. So by building perimeter that could be switched on in a crisis, the hawks would feel less impulse to launch on warning or launch a first strike, because if you have a deterrent that's going to go off no matter what, then even if the enemy doesn't know about it, even if the Americans don't know about perimeter, if you know that perimeter exists, then you don't have to launch a first strike to prevent the Americans from doing one. You don't have the same pressure at any rate. Mm-hmm. You also don't have to launch on warning. You can wait to see if it pans out or not. and you'll still have the confidence that there will be a retaliation if the attack is real.
And there are other elements that come into this as well that we won't talk about here necessarily that have to do with nuclear deterrent strategy, things like the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was something called Star Wars, and how that affected deterrent strategy and that sort of stuff. That's a different podcast altogether.
Yeah, that's a different episode.
But so go ahead.
So basically, that's the story of Perimeter, and the thing is, it's still active. It's still out there. The Russians have maintained it and upgraded it, and fortunately, I don't think it's switched on at the moment, but one day it could be.
And like you said, with Looking Glass, I mean, America, still has the National Airborne Operations Center, which is the National Command and Control system for Strategic Air Command. Although since the 90s, early 90s, it doesn't fly 24/7 anymore like it used to, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
But America still has some of that deterrence built in, and there may still be stuff that we haven't heard of that's secret in America.
Right.
So that kind of is our usual way of approaching these subjects is we look at the reason perspective and the faith perspective, and going through the different Doomsday Machines was really the reason perspective on this. Yeah. So what does our faith have to tell us about Doomsday Machines in general? What is the Catholic teaching on the acceptability, the morality of a Doomsday Machine?
Yeah, well, so I'm not aware of any magisterial document that directly addresses Doomsday Machines. As far as I'm aware, no Pope or Ecumenical Council has specifically said Doomsday Machines are bad. However, Catholic moral theology would definitely hold that attempting to end the world is bad.
Right.
Also, attempting to kill everybody on the planet, that's bad. Also, from a faith perspective, we believe as Christians that Jesus Christ is coming back. There's going to be a second coming. So even if somebody built a doomsday machine, and even if somebody triggered it, that Jesus would still come back, presumably right at that moment, and things would end well. After all, we're going to have a new heaven and a new earth, and there's prophecy the current earth is going to be burned with fire. So, who knows? There could be a doomsday-like machine involved, maybe, but it's not something the faith teaches. But what the faith does teach is that Jesus Christ is coming back, and that those who are open to God's grace will be saved eternally. So that's good. That's good news, definitely. In terms of thinking a little more deeply about the principles of nuclear deterrence that are involved here, the Church has for a long time condemned the use of weapons of mass destruction, whether they're chemical, biological, or nuclear. It also specifically condemns targeting civilians deliberately, saying we're gonna kill innocent people here as a way of putting pressure on their government or whatever. And that seems to be a key aspect of nuclear deterrence. So actually using weapons for those purposes is very morally problematic. But using a weapon and having a weapon for purposes of deterrence is a slightly different question. And on the latter question, John Paul II, Saint John Paul II now, gave a speech back in 1982, the same time frame we're talking about, where he was addressing the General Assembly of the United Nations, and he talked about deterrence. And he said this: in current conditions, deterrence based on balance, so that would be maintaining parity between the parties, certainly not as an end in itself, but as a step on the way toward a progressive disarmament, may be judged morally acceptable. So he's saying that that having a deterrence as a temporary measure with hopes of finding a way to disarmament, that can be morally acceptable. Nonetheless, he says, in order to ensure peace, it is indispensable not to be satisfied with this minimum which is always susceptible to the real danger of explosion. And I assume he's not punning there.
Right.
He means the situation could become unstable. So according to John Paul II, you could have nuclear weapons or other weapons as a deterrence in a situation where there's parity between you and the other party, and where you're working on a way to get out of this situation to where you've both renounced such weapons. And if that principle holds on the scale of weapons we're talking about, then hypothetically you could have a temporary situation where it could be morally justified to have, and I'm not endorsing this, and I'm not saying this is my view. I'm just speculating based on the principle he articulated. I could see some people saying, well, if we're in a situation where they've got a doomsday machine, it's morally legitimate for us to build a doomsday machine too, as a form of deterrence, and then maybe we can find a way to walk back from that situation.
Right.
So, there'd be a lot more thought that would have to be put into that, but it's something that does involve a principle of deterrence that's not something everyone thinks about instantly.
Okay. So taking all this into account, everything that we've discussed, what's the bottom line about doomsday machines?
The bottom line is doomsday machines are possible, and they're extraordinarily dangerous, and they're extraordinarily scary. And in my personal opinion, I would love to live in a world that doesn't have any.
That it would be nice that in the disarmament talks that are constantly going on among the world powers, that this should be part of that discussion. I would be in agreement with that. So we're going to have a bunch of resources in the show notes about this whole topic.
Including some books you can read about it. One called The Doomsday Men by Peter Smith is about Leo Szilard and the other people who developed these ideas. There's another book called The Dead Hand by David Hoffman that not only talks about perimeter, but also talks about, and the dead hand, but that also talks about extensively about the biowarfare preparations that the Soviet Union made and how Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated a walk back on everything, and how we then got access to what was going on in Russian bioweapons labs and the amazing things we found there.
I want to sleep tonight, so maybe I won't look at that one. So excellent. This has been a great discussion. I really enjoy this, not just because I lived through some of this time, but it's fascinating to learn about things that were happening when you were alive and you weren't aware of them. So that brings us to mysterious feedback. We've been hearing, like we have from the beginning, we've been hearing from listeners, and so we'd love to discuss some of your feedback. We've got a comment from YouTube from Alejandro Banuelos.
Alejandro.
I know I'm terrible at the accent. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
And he says, "I love the X-Files. And they did a very good job in keeping our curiosity alive on the unknown and mysterious. Keep this curiosity alive, guys, and with a Catholic point of view is amazing, or keeping it alive." Thank you, Alejandro. That's great.
Yeah, that's great. Glad you're enjoying the program.
And I think I know that we both love the X-Files too. So
yes.
So excellent.
Seen every episode. Well, there was one I didn't watch because I thought it would be too disturbing. But every other episode I've seen, even the bad ones.
Yes, exactly. And then from Twitter, Ashley the Texan. I love Texas. My wife is from there, so that's why. She has Ashley sent us this message. She says, "These episodes have been really interesting. My husband and I are both listeners." Well, great to hear from you, Ashley. That's excellent.
Thank you, and please share the show with others so there can be even more listeners. And we love hearing your comments, especially when you send ideas or interact with points we've made and things like that. It's great to hear from everybody.
Yeah, actually, I want to emphasize that point. There's something you just said. If you have ideas for future episodes, for topics we could cover, I mean, we've got a list already of over 150 different possible topics, and Jimmy and I are adding to them every day. But, we don't know everything. So if you've got an idea for a topic to cover, please send that along in all the various methods. I'll tell you about them in a second. After we talk about mystery headlines. What are our mystery headlines this week, Jimmy?
So in Mysterious Headlines, the first one is a story. It's not headlined this way, but I personally would have headlined it, My Mom the Neanderthal, which is a sentiment that a lot of young teenage girls may have at times about their moms. But in this case, it's real. Scientists have discovered some bone fragments from a prehistoric girl whose parents belonged to two different subspecies of humans. Her mother was a Neanderthal and her father was a Denisovian. So neither of her parents were Homo sapiens sapiens. Neither one were our species or subspecies of human. But she had mixed parentage. Normally, and what's fascinating about this find is that we know it was her mom and her dad. Normally, when we find evidence of crossbreeding between different human subspecies, it's like in the distant past. So it'll just be a tiny trace of Neanderthal DNA or something like that. One of your ancestors thousands of years ago did it, mated with a Neanderthal or something. This, though, it's her mom and her dad. So this is a first generation crossbreed. And it would be extraordinarily rare for us to find this. So it's a very interesting discovery. And we have a link to an article on New Scientist about that.
Okay.
Also, we have an article from Vox.com about why we haven't found aliens. That's something we were talking about a couple of weeks ago with the Fermi paradox. And so this article goes into some ideas that we really didn't have as much of a chance to go into, like the Drake equation, which is a way of guesstimating how common alien technological civilizations should be. And so if you want to learn more about that, you can check out that article from some perspective. Then in Popular Mechanics, we have a link to an article on a Kindle satellite that's been proposed. So as you may know, a Kindle device, one of the Amazon reading devices, at least the classic versions, have a kind of electronic ink that they use, which is very low power, and it forms words on your screen by like flipping a small element that's black on one side and white on the other. And this guy in this article has proposed that we cover a satellite with not that exactly, but something that works on the same principle. The reason is it would enable satellites to have better temperature control. Because if part of the satellite color is actually very important on satellites. That's why they tend to be like either silver or gold or white or things like that. So they reflect sunlight rather than absorb heat, because they don't have the atmosphere to protect them and stuff.
Right.
And so heat management is a big issue in satellites. And so the idea is, let's say you're facing the sun, you could flip the little elements to white to reflect as much of the sun's rays as possible. But then the part of the satellite that's faced away from the sun could have them flipped to black to help manage heat on that side by letting more heat in, say, from Earthshine. Also, this has the potential to even help with the maneuvering of the satellite, because light pressure can be used on the principle of a light sail to help move even spaceships around. And so the satellite, by adjusting the color of its skin, could potentially get little nudges, like a little bitty light sail, from the rays of the sun.
That's fascinating. Wow.
Yeah.
Think of this. Great. So those are 3 headlines, and we'll have the links in our show notes for you to check them out. Very interesting stories there. So I think that sort of wraps up for us. I want to reiterate for you folks to please like the show wherever you see it on whatever social media your platform you see it, to write us reviews wherever you find the show on iTunes and Google Play and the various places, to send us your comments, to subscribe to the podcast either as a podcast feed or as a YouTube. We post these on YouTube as audio videos that are audio only with an image. And then make sure you get notifications. And please, as Jimmy said, share the show with others. If you're enjoying this, chances are other people are going to enjoy it too. And that's it from us now. We want to hear from you, though. What do you think about the secret Soviet doomsday machines and the concept of these doomsday machines? Let us know by going to sqpn.com or the SQPN Facebook page or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page. Leave us some feedback there on the show, that's the post for the show there, or send us an email to mysterious@sqpn.com. You can send a written email, you can send an audio email, like attach an audio file to your email, so we could even hear your voice, just like we heard Dr. Strangelove on today's episode. We can hear your feedback. You can find links to all of the resources and the headlines on our show notes at sqpn.com, as well as links to our social media and our websites. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thank you, Dom.
Once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. This is Dom Bettinelli again. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast and that you'll help us keep producing the podcast you love. Thank you for your generosity. To make your pledge and find out about the free thank you gifts we'd like to send you, visit sqpn.com/give. That's sqpn.com/give.